기록했습니다. 민간인이 숨졌습니다.
In any case, the sense of empathy that I'm talking about so this is neither good nor bad. It's a tool. Thank you. And I'm particularly honored to be part of this extremely illustrious and important lecture series. And I'm also grateful for all of you for being here. I wrote this book. This book was published a few months ago, but it took me about 3 years to write. And as I wrote it, I would go to parties and see people, and people would ask me, "What are you up to?" And I would tell them the truth. I'd say, "I'm writing a new book." And to be polite, they would say, "What's it about?" And I'd say, "It's about empathy." And when I say the word empathy, people would smile. And then I would say, "I'm against it." And that gets a little bit of a nervous laugh. To be against empathy seems to many people to be crazy, like a joke. It's like being against world peace, being against kittens. How could one be against empathy? But I am against empathy, and in this hour or so that we have, I want to convince you to be against empathy too. What I want to do is, I want to first quickly lay out the argument I have against empathy, and then I want to consider about 4 objections to my argument. Now, part of the problem is that the English word empathy means many things, many different things. And I've been told that the Korean word that's being used for empathy has the same problem. So I want to be clear about what I'm saying. One sense of empathy is this: concern, compassion, kindness, love, morality, basically everything good. I'm not against that. I really think we should love each other, we should be concerned about each other, we should be moral people. If that's what you mean by empathy, I have no disagreement with you. Another sense of empathy is the capacity to judge what others are thinking and feeling. And sometimes we call this emotional intelligence, or theory of mind, or intuitive psychology. And I'm not against this either, because in order to be a good person, you have to understand other people. If I'm going to buy a birthday present for my niece, if I'm going to help out a friend who's had a difficult divorce, I need to know what's going on in their heads. Anybody who wishes to make the world a better place has to have some sense of what's going on in the minds of other people. On the other hand, I do not think this makes us good, this ability. This ability is a form of intelligence. And like any other form of intelligence, it could be used for good or for evil. Just as a good person benefits from understanding the minds of other people, someone who's a seducer or a con man or a bully or a sadist would also benefit from understanding the minds of other people. So this is neither good nor bad. It's a tool. And this tool could be used for any purpose. In any case, the sense of empathy that I'm talking about was introduced by the great philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith, hundreds of years ago. He used a different word for it. He used the English word sympathy for it, but it matches exactly right with what psychologists and philosophers view as empathy. And so he describes it like this: when we feel empathy for another, we place ourselves in his situation and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations, and even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them. In other words, to use an expression, an English expression, we put ourselves in other people's shoes. And Smith provides an example. When we see a stroke aimed and just ready to fall upon the leg or arm of another person, we naturally shrink and draw back our own leg or our arm. And when it does fall, we feel it in some measure and are hurt by it as well as the sufferer. This is my favorite picture of empathic response. You imagine the pain of another, and you feel it. For me, it's if I see somebody's thumb about to be hit by a hammer, I go, you feel it. And there's a lot of science about empathy now, a lot of psychology and a lot of neuroscience. So the neuroscience experiments, there are dozens, probably hundreds by now, but they all kind of work in the same way. What you do is you show somebody, you have a subject who's in a lab, maybe they're having their brain scanned, and they're watching somebody else. And this other person is having some sort of bad experience. Maybe they're being poked, or mildly shocked, or slightly burned. And you watch what happens when our person whose head is in that scanner feels empathy for that person. And what you find is remarkable. What you find is the very same part of that person's brain is active as if he himself were poked or shocked or burnt. In other words, we literally feel other people's pain. And this is very exciting. And it's been long speculated that this plays an important role in our mental and our psychological and our moral lives. So I'll give some examples. The psychologist Daniel Batson is probably the world's biggest empathy scholar. And he has coined what he calls the empathy altruism hypothesis. And this is the more empathy you feel, I feel your pain, I feel what it's like to be you, the more likely I am to help you, to go and act to help you. And as you can see, if this is true, and there's quite a bit of evidence for it, empathy looks like a powerful moral force. The psychologist Martin Hoffman argues empathy is the core of morality developmentally. So even though your morality right now may be complicated and subtle and involve all sorts of things, for a young child or a baby, the core capacity is empathy. And all morality stems from this. Franz de Waal, the famous primatologist, takes this one step further. He argues that even non-human primates, like chimpanzees and baboons and macaques, feel some degree of empathy. And he argues not just in development, but also in evolution in our species and other species. Empathy is the core of morality. We don't live in an age of reason, he says. We live in an age of empathy. And finally, the British psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen, one of the world's experts on autism, argues that makes a very strong claim that evil is nothing more and nothing less than a decrease in empathy. That is, if you look at an evil person, you will find that he or she has low empathy. And if you look at somebody who has low empathy, you will find that he or she is an evil person. Now, these fans of empathy will say it's like a spotlight. It zooms you in. So I look at you now and there's just people and you're kind of a blur. And how can I care about any one of you? Just looking at you as a mass. But if I have empathy, the light shines on one of you. And it's you I care about. And this is an old insight. So the dictator, Joseph Stalin, once said, he might not have said this, but it's often attributed to him, a single death is a tragedy. 1 million deaths is a statistic. Mother Teresa did say this in an interview. She said, If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will. And empathy helps us look at the one. And there's scientific studies in support of this. So one line of research is by the psychologists Deborah Small and George Lowenstein. And what they do is they have a study. And in their experiment, they give one, you don't have to read the details, but they just give one group of people a lot of information about a crisis. Just lots of information, everything they would need to know. And you find in that condition, then they see how much money they'll give to help the crisis. And in this condition, they gave a little bit more than $1 American. But in the other condition, they don't give numbers at all. They don't give data. They don't try to spark empathy. What they do is they show a picture. They show a picture, they give a name, they make it personal. And this causes a big bump in how much money people will give. Now some of you may be suspicious about findings from a psychology lab, but this is something which we see in the real world as well. I bet some of you here have worked on charities. And you know if you want people to give to your charity, you don't give them a lot of information. What you do is you find a picture of somebody who they could feel empathy for, who you could spark their feelings. And then take the real world. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this picture. It's a picture of a Syrian child drowned on a beach in Greece, a refugee. And one reason why I'm sure many of you have seen it is it was in newspapers all around the world. And it turned out that when that picture was shown, it had an effect. The psychologist Paul Slovic, looking at donations to the Swedish Red Cross, found there's a spike in donations, many more, just when a picture came out. So what you see here, and right now I'm making the case in favor of empathy, these are examples of the power of empathy. But empathy has its limitations. Even if you're empathy's biggest fan as a moral force, you have to admit that sometimes we have moral feelings about right and wrong that can't be explained in terms of empathy. So for instance, we can appreciate bad things that have diffuse consequences. And what I mean by that is they have consequences that there's no specific individual who's harmed. So I'm sure everybody in this room would think it's wrong to throw trash out of a car window, or to cheat on your taxes, or for a scientist to make up his or her data, or for a journalist to lie in a newspaper article. And all of these things can be wrong, even if there's no specific individual person who's harmed. You see this, there's no single person who's hurt. There's nobody to empathize with. And yet still, your morality says, that's wrong. It's wrong because if everybody did it, the world would be a terrible place. It's wrong because it causes a little bit of harm. So this is one case where empathy can't explain what we're interested in. Then there's other cases where empathy and morality are actually at war with each other. And I want to give an example that was actually from an experiment by Dan Batson. You're told about a little girl. Her name is Sherry Summers. She has a name. And an age, she's 11 years old. And you are told that she is going to die. She has a terminal illness that will kill her. And in fact, there's nothing you can do about that. There is, however, a treatment. This treatment will not save her life, but it will make her pain improve. It will make her suffering go away. But, as often happens with different healthcare systems, the treatment is in short supply. There's not enough to go around. And in fact, there's a list of children who will get this treatment. And she is low on the list. She will not get the treatment before she dies. Here's the question that Batson asked the subjects, and I will ask to you. Should you move her up the list? Imagine you're a hospital administrator. You can, if you choose, just move her up the list. But if you do, then some other child who is going to get the treatment will do without. Do you do it? So answer the question in the privacy of your own heads, but I will tell you, most people say no. Most people say it's unfortunate what happened, it's too bad, but if it's a fair list, that's the way it goes. But then Batson had one other condition in his experiment. He told another group of people exactly the same thing. But this time he also said, try to imagine what it's like to be her. Try to put yourself in her shoes and feel what she's feeling. An empathy invitation. And now things flipped. Now most people said, yeah, we'll move her up the list. Yeah, some other kid gets kicked off. It's the way it goes. Now Batson says, empathy there has led you to make the wrong decision. If it's a fair list, the list should stay. And if so, this would be a weakness of empathy. I think empathy really is like a spotlight. But spotlights have their problems. They have a narrow focus. They zoom in only on one person. If I was to care about all of you, that's not how empathy works. Empathy can make me care about you, or you, or you. Also, spotlights light up where we point them. We often point them in the wrong places. What I want to suggest then is because of this, empathy is biased, it's enumerate, it doesn't pay attention to numbers, even when numbers are important. It's concrete, it focuses on the immediate here and now without focusing on broader consequences, and it's myopic, it's short-sighted, saying basically the same thing. It just zooms in very narrowly. There's all sorts of ways I could give the example. I'm going to give the example, and these are going to be very American examples from my own upbringing. But I think, though, they're specific American examples. They will speak to you, and I bet you could find your own examples from your own experience. And what I'm giving you is examples of the sorts of things in my lifetime that people in the States got very, very interested in and very focused on. So one case is little children who get stuck in wells. For some reason, and I can't explain why, but every 10 years or so, a child gets stuck in a well, and it has to be rescued. We get intensely interested when this happens. We are very interested when people, particularly like teenagers, particularly attractive young teenagers, attractive white teenagers often, are the victims of crimes. That captivates the country. As in the case of Natalie Holloway, who was kidnapped and murdered while on vacation in Aruba. And what really captures our attention is mass shootings. My country has many mass shootings. This is a clip from what happened in Newtown, Connecticut, about 4 years ago, not far from where I live, where a killer went into an elementary school, murdered 20 children and 6 teachers. Now, these are very important. But you can ask, why these? Why these and not others? So the psychologist Paul Slovic, for instance, points out that when Natalie Holloway went missing, there were tens of thousands of children in Africa dying from famines, from war, and yet the network news in the United States devoted 13 more times coverage to this one person, Natalie Holloway, than to all of Africa. Or take mass shootings. Mass shootings are terrible. They're very significant and very important. But it turns out that in the United States, mass shootings are responsible for 0.1% of United States murders. That's such a small proportion that if you could snap your fingers and make it so that there'll never be a mass homicide again, nobody would ever notice you did so, looking at crime statistics. So why, if it's not the absolute importance in terms of suffering that makes us look at these things, what focuses us on them? What makes them so important? And I think part of the answer is when our feelings are involved, numbers don't matter anymore. And I'll illustrate this from an experiment done a long time ago. And it's part of the research program of Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work. And in this study, it's a very simple study, and again, you could do this in your own head. Sometimes there's oil spills. If there's an oil spill, often there's birds that get covered up with oil. And the birds have to be cleaned, or else they'll die. So you ask people, how much money would you spend to save the lives of 2,000 birds? So answer that in the privacy of your own head. How much money would you spend for that? And they asked people, and the answer they got in their study was $80 American. Okay. I don't know if it's high, if it's low, but maybe your number was different. That's the answer they got. But then they asked another group of people, how much money would you spend to save the lives of 20,000 birds? And their answer was $78. And then they asked a third group, how much money would you spend to save the lives of 200,000 birds? And their answer was $88. And what they concluded was, people weren't paying attention to the numbers at all. When it comes to our feelings, the numbers don't matter. And that's one problem, because the numbers, when we think about it, the numbers really do matter. 200,000 birds is a lot more than 2,000 birds. 10,000 lives is 9,000 lives more than 1,000 lives. When we think about it, they matter. When we use our feelings, they don't. And then there's bias. This was a cartoon done at the height of the Ebola crisis. And it was used to bring people's attention to the fact that there was so much attention brought to the very few white victims of the crisis at the expense of the very many dark-skinned victims of the crisis. Capturing the fact that when it comes to our feelings, race matters, ethnicity matters. People are naturally drawn to care much more about the suffering of their own group than the suffering of other groups. And this shows up in all sorts of ways. All this racial bias. This is a classic study done in the States by Jennifer Eberhardt. And she found that if you hold everything equal in the criminal justice system, the type of crime, the background of the victim, the criminal record of the criminal, you are far more likely to be sentenced to death if you look like the man on the right than the man on the left. That we are strongly biased by racial factors. Or take this study. This is one of my favorite studies. It was done in Europe with soccer fans. And the way the experiment was done was the person sat and they have their brain being scanned. And then they're watching, and what they're watching is another man being shocked. And they're watching a man being shocked. And half the subjects are told, this man being shocked, he's a fan of your same soccer team. And for that group, the same parts of the brain are active. You wiggle, oh my God, you wiggle with him. But the other half were told, you see the man being shocked, he's a fan of the opposing soccer team. Now you don't get empathy. In fact, what you find is that areas of the brain that are devoted to pleasure light up as you watch him be shocked. So none of these problems, innumeracy or bias, are special to empathy. They're more general factors of our psychological and emotional lives. But empathy is particularly vulnerable to them. it's vulnerable to them because of its spotlight nature. Now I want to consider some objections. So here's one objection you could think of. Empathy might not be perfect, but it's always a force for good. It might, so maybe it's biased, maybe it would lead me to help a white person over a dark-skinned person, a man over a woman, an American over a Korean. But still, at least I'm helping people. At least it's doing some good. But it doesn't always work that way. Let me first start with a hypothetical example. Imagine a vaccine program. And imagine this vaccine program was saving lives. By vaccinating children, it was saving 50 lives a year. But now imagine, due to some mistake, a little girl dies because of the vaccine. My bet is that you'd then stop the vaccine program, that people would demand that it be stopped. Even though, on balance, it's saving a lot more lives than it's harming. Even though stopping the program will lead to people dying. But the people dying are abstract and statistical, and empathy screams out in favor of the specific. Or take this example from the journalist Linda Pullman. She asked warlords of an African country a question nobody had ever asked them before. She asked them, "Why do you chop off the limbs of children?" Just terrible atrocity. Why do you do it? And the answer she got was very surprising. The answer she got was, "We do it for you. If we don't do atrocities, people from your country don't come. And when you come, you give us money and resources and food and so on. We want to make you come here." Or take another example, that of child beggars. Children begging for food in parts of India and parts of Africa, it's terrible to see this. And as a rich, well-fed, affluent person, it's often impossible to resist giving money to them. But many people have argued that when you give money to them, you actually make the world worse. They're basically enslaved by adult criminals who take the money you give to them. And by giving them money, then you're supporting an organization that causes an enormous amount of suffering. The solution, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything, but if you give money to organizations like Oxfam, you can make the world much better. But giving money to these kids, as awful as it seems, makes the world worse. I was doing a radio interview in England many years ago on my last book about morality. And we were talking about charity, and I just read about this problem. So I mentioned it in a radio interview, and the other person who was being interviewed was this minister. And when I said this, she was shocked. She said to me, "That's terrible. That's the worst thing I've ever heard." When I see a child who's suffering, I help. I reach over and our hands touch, and there's a moment of intimate connection. Giving to Oxfam is cold and calculating, and I didn't know what to say. I'm very slow, and I don't like having confrontations. So I probably said, maybe you're right. But now, years later, I have my response. And my response is, it depends what you want. If what you want is to feel good about yourself, to have a rush of happiness, you should give to charity, particularly to children in front of you. In fact, as the philosopher Peter Singer says, the best way to increase your own pleasure is to give a lot of money, but spread it out for a little money to each of the many, many, many charities. Like there's an enormous buffet, and you're plucking from each of the dishes just a little bit. That's how to really get a lot of pleasure. If you actually want to help people and make the world a better place, you should do something different. Now, I want to suggest that empathy could not only cause harm in this way, it could have much worse consequences. So I want us to consider for a minute atrocities. Atrocities like the Holocaust of the Jews and other people in Europe in the early 1900s, and lynchings of African Americans in the South. Now, social psychologists and political scientists will tell you that these atrocities have all sorts of causes, and they do, dehumanization and cruelty and jealousy and in-group, out-group. But what I want to suggest is, one of the causes is empathy. Not empathy for the people you're killing, of course, but empathy for those who are said to be their victims. Whenever there's a movement to attack a group of people, what often provokes it are stories about the cruelties that this group of people have done to other individuals. There were stories told about blacks in the South raping white women. There were stories told about Jewish pedophiles preying on young German children. And these stories, and this is an insight from Adam Smith, when you hear these stories about victims and you feel empathy for the victims, it energizes you to want to strike back at those who have harmed them. And none of them, this is historical, is part of ancient history. I'll read the headline. The headline from this magazine from a few years ago is "Now They're Gassing Children. Chemical weapons kill 1,300." And it was, and the story of these weapons motivated the bombing of Syria. More recently, when Donald Trump did his own bombing, he said it was because of the videos he saw. They moved him. Should we ever, our country, my country, your country, other countries of the world, go into a full-scale war against ISIS, more and more of these videos will be used to show, to motivate people to want to go to war. Now, I'm not a pacifist. Sometimes going to war might be the right thing. But empathy pushes us too much with a desire to punish, a desire to hurt. And it's too easily used by demagogues who want to make people go to war. In collaboration with one of my students, Nick Stignaro, I did some experiments on this. I'll just tell you about one of them. We told people stories about an atrocity. A journalists were kidnapped in a faraway country. They were tortured and they were murdered. And we told a story in some detail to get them to feel empathy for these victims. Then we asked, what should America do in response? And we gave answers on a continuum. They could say nothing. America should do nothing. They should do criticism. They should slow down foreign aid. They should stop foreign aid. They should threaten military action. They should have airstrikes, or they should invade. And then we also measured how empathic they are, because people differ in their empathy. So we gave people an empathy scale to see how empathic they are. And what we found, as predicted, was the more empathy they had, the more willing they were to have a violent reprisal. And so if somebody tells you empathy is always on the side of helping the world and being kind to people, tell them about these data. Tell them that empathy can often drive people towards a violent impulse. Okay, suppose I convinced you that empathy has some problems with foreign policy. Still, you might say, well, but it's essential for certain valuable relationships, like between a doctor and a patient. And I have a cartoon here. He says to the other guy, it helps me empathize, because he also has his pants down. It's my favorite cartoon in the world. And you might think that doctors should feel empathy for their patients. Now, again, it depends what you mean by empathy. If you mean they should care about their patients, sure. If you mean they should try to understand their patients, absolutely. If you mean they should show respect for their patients, definitely. But should they feel the pain of their patients? Should they experience what their patients are experiencing? I think then it gets more complicated when it comes to therapy. Psychiatrists and therapists and psychologists, where it's very important if you see somebody for mental illness or for depression or for anxiety, for that person to understand you and for that person to care about you. Nobody would deny that that's important. But you're not understanding therapy right if you think that person has to feel what you feel. On the contrary, that would make them very bad at what they do. If I go to my therapist and I say, I'm so depressed, I'm terribly sad, I don't want her to start crying. I want her to look at me and try to figure out what's wrong with me and try to help me without the problems of my emotions. If she gets upset when dealing with me, now I have two problems, not just one. I think, by the way, to add this, that this is the same with parents. So, suppose you're a parent of a child, and your child is very upset about something. So for me, I won't tell you the name of my child who did this, because he'll get upset, because it's on TV. But he comes to me and says, I haven't done my homework for tomorrow, and he's very upset. And I say, okay, you'll just do it now. And he says, but I was supposed to work on that for the last month. So he's very upset. I am not at my best as a parent if I get upset too. If I get, oh my God, this is terrible. I'm at my best as a parent with my kids when I say, I love you, I care for you, let's try to make the situation better. And in general, in relationships, we're often at our best when we don't get caught up in the other person's feelings, particularly if they're bad feelings, like sadness or anxiety. The third argument, you could say, look, I'm arguing against empathy, but aren't people of low empathy terrible? You might think of a psychopathic killer, like the star of the movie Silence of the Lambs. Or in general, you might think of psychopaths. So this is a test. It's a list of the symptoms that go with being a psychopath. I won't read them to you. They're things like pathological lying, lack of guilt, low self-control, early behavioral problems, and yes, lack of empathy. It is true that psychopaths lack empathy. But let me tell you two things about that. One thing is, it's true psychopaths lack empathy. But it's also true that people with autism or Asperger's syndrome, by the very same measures, also lack empathy. But they're not cruel people. So it seems like lacking empathy does not automatically make you bad. But here's the other thing. There were studies that asked the question, which sort of psychopaths go on to commit criminal acts? Which go on to do terrible things? And it turns out that lack of empathy has no predictive power at all. The factors that have to do with whether or not a psychopath is going to go on to make trouble later on isn't lack of empathy. The factors are lack of self-control, impulsivity, and a history of violence. In fact, the best predictor of whether a psychopath who's released from prison will commit a violent crime is whether or not he was there for a violent crime in the first place. Now you could say, oh, that's psychopaths. Who cares about psychopaths? But it's true for the rest of us as well. Now finally, it's often said that, well, we need empathy. Without empathy, why would we do good? Why would we ever help the world? Why would we make the world a better place? I hear that a lot, but it seems to me to reflect a failure of imagination. Think about the good things you've done. Helping a friend, giving to charity, going out of your way to volunteer for something, a kind word to somebody who was sad. Maybe you were motivated by empathy, feeling what they were feeling. But you don't have to be. It seems strange to say that if you give money to help out children dying in a famine, starving children, you have to feel what it's like to be starving. Seems nuts. You could just say, that's terrible, I want to help. In fact, there's a difference between emotion in general and the role of reason or rationality in figuring out what makes us a good person. And this brings us back to our hero, Adam Smith. So Adam Smith gave a famous example. I'm going to change it slightly to make it more modern or more clear. But he says, how would you feel if you heard that thousands of people died in a faraway country? And what he said was, you'd say, okay, that's too bad, it's awful. Then he said, so hold that in your mind, how would you feel if tomorrow you're going to have your little finger chopped off? He said, you wouldn't sleep tonight. It'd be very upsetting. So ask yourself, which is more emotionally upsetting? Losing your finger or 1,000 people dying? It's obvious. Losing your finger. Now ask yourself, would you rather have 1,000 people die rather than lose your little finger? Now, I've never had the courage to ask people to raise their hand to give an answer. But I imagine people could recognize, intellectually at least, that the lives of thousands of people matter a lot more than their little finger. And how do we explain this? And Smith says, it's not our emotions. And he describes it in very flowery terms. It's not the soft power of humanity. It's not that feeble spark of benevolence which nature has lifted up in the human heart. Rather, it is reason, principle, conscience that calls to us with a voice capable of astonishing the most presumptuous of our passions, that we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. And this part is what philosophers call impartiality. The idea that I love my child so much, and you there and back, I don't even know you. I don't love you. But I recognize that the life of my child matters as much as your life. That from the standpoint, stepping back, even though I know some of you and don't know others, and there's people I love and people who are strangers, stepping back for us to be truly moral involves an attitude of impartiality and distance. And this is the foundation of religions and philosophies. This is research in an amazing collaboration between the neuroscientist Tanya Singer and the Buddhist monk and biologist Matthew Ricard. And what they did was they put people in a brain scanner and they got them to either feel empathy towards other people or they got them to feel compassion towards other people. And they summarized the results like this. Compassion is an other-related emotion. It connects to other people. It's linked to positive feelings like love. It leads to good health and approach and kindness. But empathy, they argued, leads to empathic distress, which is a self-related emotion, leads to negative feelings like stress, poor health and burnout, and withdrawal and non-social behavior. Now, I've argued against empathy, but I'm only against empathy when it comes to moral behavior, moral decision-making, and moral guidance. Empathy has other advantages. This is my son, Zachary, who I will admit is the same one who didn't do his homework. Now, and he is having a great time. And when I took this picture, I was having a great time too. In part because I love him, and it was nice to see him happy. But in part because I put myself in his shoes, and I felt what he was feeling. And empathy could be a great source of pleasure like that, because you could feel the pleasures of other people. You could have children and enjoy what it's like all over again to have your first ice cream cone, to see fireworks for the first time. You can enjoy through the pleasure of feeling empathy for fictional characters. One of the great pleasures of life, reading and movies and television, where so much of what the pleasure is imagining yourself in another person's shoes. I would not, if you ask me, would I make empathy go away? Absolutely not. Because empathy is a wonderful source of pleasure. Now, at this point, there's a final argument you might make in favor of empathy, which is in fiction, when we read fiction and feel empathy for others, it might zoom us in and make us care. So the philosopher Martha Nussbaum gives an example of Greek tragedies. And she writes, although all of the future citizens who saw ancient tragedies were male, they were asked to have empathy for the suffering of many whose lot could never be theirs, such as Trojans and Persians and Africans, such as wives and daughters and mothers. And through history, say through American history, this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a work of fiction, but it got its readers at the time, who were mostly white people, many of them slave owners, to imagine what it's like to be a slave, to put themselves in the shoes of a slave. And arguably, this caused a great social good. And so our TV programs now that, for instance, get people to imagine what it's like to feel empathy for characters who are of a different sexuality than they are. So, empathy can do good. And empathy for fictional characters can do good. I'd be wrong to deny that. But I think people too quickly ignore other fictional engagement with characters that can have a less positive role. This is my favorite book in the world. It's Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. And those of you who, I envy those of you who haven't read it yet, because now you have the chance to read it. And it's the story of an older man's pursuit of basically a prepubescent girl, his sexual pursuit. And he is a monster. But I dare you to get more than 20 pages in the book without feeling empathy for him, without putting yourself in his shoes and adopting his goals as if they were your own. So the problem with empathy for fictional characters is it can drive you to feel for a good person, but also feel for a bad person. And so for every Uncle Tom's Cabin, which gets you to feel empathy for slaves, there's a book like Hitler's Mein Kampf, who gets you to feel empathy for those who would create concentration camps. For every Schindler's List that gets you to feel empathy for the victims of the Holocaust, there's a movie like Birth of a Nation, which gets you to feel empathy for terrible racist characters who are trying to exterminate blacks. I hate terminological arguments. I hate arguments about semantics and about words. I don't care how you use the word empathy. And I don't care how you use the Korean word that means empathy in English. There's all sorts of meanings of that word which are totally okay. I'm not talking about a word here. I'm talking, and so for instance, if you want to use empathy to mean concern, compassion, kindness, love, morality, that's wonderful. What I'm talking about is a very specific notion. I'm talking about the act of putting yourself in another person's shoes, feeling what they feel, being one with them. I agree, I would insist that this is a wonderful source of pleasure and happiness, and it enriches our lives. But I also think when it comes to motivating us to do good things, and when it comes to helping us make decisions about right and wrong, doing the right thing, it is terrible. It is a moral train wreck. So I'm against empathy, and I hope I can encourage the rest of you to be against empathy with me. Thank you.